sponsored by the Salina League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan group organized to encourage participation in the political process and to encourage good government and to disseminate good information so that from the time women got the vote, which was 98 years ago now, we needed good information for men and women to make the decisions to vote and to encourage our elected officials to do the right thing. So we continue to try to do that. We appreciate you being here today. Some of the good information we're trying to disseminate. Let me mention that next month, March, the second Tuesday in March, which will also be the 13th of March, we have a program on agricultural burning with Brian Sherpon. Today we have Aubrey Streit-Krug, who is on the staff at the Land Institute. She's originally from Tipton, and she's going to tell us a little more about herself, but she's going to talk mainly today about Ecosphere studies. So please welcome Aubrey.
Well, thank you all very much for welcoming me and for being here with me during your lunch break. Thank you for sharing your time. As Anne asked, I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. I grew up in Tipton, so not too far from here. My parents still live outside of Tipton and farm and ranch. I'm from a big family and have a lot of ties there, and it's been a real pleasure to be back closer to family. After growing up in Tipton, I did my undergrad at Bethany College in Lindsborg, where I studied English and communications, and also did a semester-long internship at the Land Institute in communications, and that's where I first met Wes Jackson and learned about all the exciting work going on at the Land Institute. After I finished my undergraduate degree, I moved to Europe and taught English and African literature in Bratislava in Slovakia. And then I came back and worked at Bethany for a few years in communications. And after that, I moved to Nebraska, to Lincoln, Nebraska, to do my graduate work in English and Great Plains Studies. So I study stories of relationship between plants and peoples on the Great Plains. So I'm interested in ethnobotany, and I've also become a student of the Omaha language, Omaha-Iete, and have become part of a textbook project, one of the first Omaha language and culture textbooks, which is coming out with the University of Nebraska Press this summer, in summer 2018. I'm really excited about. So while I was finishing my graduate work, I got a call from the Land Institute and heard about this new developing program of Ecosphere studies, and that was in 2015. And since then, I have had the great fortune to sort of learn about and become involved in and participate in some of the work that I'm going to be sharing with you today. I moved back to Salina after I finished my PhD this past summer and began my work as a postdoc, as a postdoctoral fellow in the Ecosphere Studies program out at the Land Institute. So I'm really happy to be back here in Salina in this watershed of the Smoky Hill River, which my Omaha friends know as Pai Shudeke, which is also the Smoky Hill River in Omaha. And I gratefully acknowledge that we're here in the lands of the Kansa and the Pawnee. So thank you to the League of Women Voters in Salina for this kind invitation. As a feminist who favors civic engagement, I really appreciate the work of this organization across the spectrum. And thank you, of course, to the Salina Public Library for hosting. I've spent many hours, if not by this point, like years of my life with my face buried in a book, reading, mostly library books, so I'm really grateful to all the librarians and teachers who've made that possible. So today, though, we're going to begin by not thinking about where we are inside. So we're going out into the field together. I want you to come walking with me in the blowing chaff of the hot south wind, through the lines of stubble scratched across my dad's wheat field in June, which is what you're seeing here. I would like you to climb up into the ladder, see, of the combine. So we're out in the field. The wind is hot. The wheat stubble is blowing, it's scratching. We're climbing up the ladder into the combine cab or perching on that armrest inside. We're listening to the fossil-fueled slicing of grasses as we buzz and bump along. We're turning and seeing the liquid stream of grain flow in. We can overhear the men radio updates about the threat of rain from the cold front in the forecast, and we might squint to take note of those distant clouds gathering. In the midst of these intimidating machines, entangled in complicated systems of winds and waters and people and creatures and carbon and history and markets, all together here in this place, we are, like me, just a child, just children, who can feel both the beauty and also the brokenness. We might seek reassurance by rubbing a soft coat of dry dirt between our fingertips out in this field. Is that soil that we're feeling? This is my son playing in the dirt out at the barn after Prairie Festival. Is the soil that we're feeling separate from us, or is it part of us? Is it dead matter, or is it a part of a living community? As it billows up around us, as it washes downstream, or as it's infiltrated by chemicals, could we tell the longer story of soil's genesis? You might know this photograph by Jim Richardson. It's a beautiful photo. Can we say the names of this soil's parents, its gentle or violent ancestors, the way that we can name our own? In a landscape that's so drawn by the skyline, what Deborah Marquardt calls the horizontal world that we know as Kansans, what do we actually verifiably know of the soil horizons which support us and the plants fed by soil who feed us? Through asking questions like these, I've come to realize that while I'm familiar with soil and fields through my own experience, I have precious little understanding of them beyond a sense of how they're slipping away. So we can click. And in this hazy light of knowledge, of this recognition of my own kind of ignorance, the field that we just imaginally visited, the family farming operation I've grown up with here, becomes to me more strange and surprising and mysterious. What have we farmers and producers and eaters of this surplus grain that we've been producing, what have we been doing with agriculture on these Great Plains in a bigger sense? So here is where I start to envision a movie view, a view from above, a sort of time lapse of conquest. You can leave it here for a while. Yeah, so here we settlers come along. You can picture in the big vision. Here we come along to settle in groups, to clear land. There we go, commandeering, steering the plow. And then there's this annual rerun, this repeat for season after season, where we're busy selecting and sharing and stitching seeds and water, and now anhydrous ammonia with loop after loop of fossil fuels into the topsoil skin of this continent. In a geological blink, and at a stunning scale across the continent, we use tools and we make incisions and we shear off these harvests. Agriculture is indeed a powerful operation. But are we farmers, we farming culture, we farming peoples, taking apart more than we're putting together? And is this particular way of living, which so many humans have participated in over the last 10,000, 12,000 years, is this way of living really as normal and natural, as inevitable as I'd always assumed it to be? What if soil isn't separate from us, isn't dead matter? What if we humans are more permeable, more susceptible to influences? What if we ourselves are more diverse compositions than we've ever been able to realize? What if, by taking a new perspective, I could stop trying to break everything down into pieces in order to understand it, and start trying to understand by tracing forces of connection and relationship? This would be an unsettling shift in value from human-centric to eco-centric. This is also some of my family's land. This is a pasture in the Blue Hills by Tipton. You can see that little cedar creeping in along the shoreline there. You can also see a lot of really fragrant and beautiful milkweed in bloom. This is in the spring. This would be a deeply ecological worldview, an ecosystems perspective that challenges the industrial model, which defines contemporary ways of feeding human bodies and minds. This could involve new conceptions of identity and creativity, and new meanings of life and death. This could involve a rethinking and remembering of old knowledge. This could maybe be healing. So you can flip. Since it was founded in 1976, the Land Institute, as many of you probably know, has been exploring how to transform human relationships with a more than human world. From our ecocentric worldview has emerged a recognition of nature as measure and source, a remembering of the truth that we land animals come from and are dependent upon communities and places within the planet. And also, from our ecocentric worldview has emerged an analysis of how agriculture shaped human relationships with the more than human world. In our farming at a wide scale, we participate in an increasingly extractive and simplifying relationship to the earth, taking from it and taking apart its living complexity. When you bring these two insights together, this idea of nature as measure and this analysis of agriculture in a long time scale, you can start to understand the Land Institute's program of natural systems agriculture. Natural systems agriculture works on the premise that we should look to nature and wild ecosystems like prairies to transform the soil draining annual monocultures by creating perennial grain crops that hold soil and also working to grow them together in mixtures and polycultures. So in other words, there's a recognition here of a larger and a longer way that the world is. A diagnosis of agriculture as a practice that has implications for that larger and longer world's ability to sustain humans, and a resulting idea that humans might need and want to transform our agriculture by trying to bring it back to fit into the context of the world. So what is this context of the world? Where are the bounds of what we know? The truth might be more than just that we're individual active organisms, we're the movers and shakers, and we're surrounded by mostly passive environments or backgrounds. The truth might be more interesting and more complex. The scientists who study the origin and development of the universe are now able to outline and verify a framework for how our rocky planet came to be in the cosmos, and of the evolutionary journey on Earth, from minerals to cells to organisms. We humans live on a planet that is swirling with systems. You can see here some of them. And we've tended to name these processes, because of the shape of our planet, as different spheres. So the jet streams and winds of the atmosphere, the ocean currents and rainfalls of the hydrosphere, tectonic plates and mountains of the lithosphere, the animals and plants of the biosphere. You might think about the ice of the cryosphere. You might think about the soil formation of the pedosphere. But I would ask, does it really make sense to separate out bios, life? Would we humans, as examples of that bios, be possible? Could we be breathing and communicating and eating and drinking a little bit right now, maybe, if not for the whole framework, for the whole journey, for that whole context? So if we have to set the bounds of what we humans seek to know, where should we set them and why? So here's our current working suggestion, a very famous image taken from Apollo 17. And to explain why, I'm going to read a fairly long excerpt from an essay by the late ecologist J. Stan Rowe. So these are Rowe's words. Let me share. Here we see, we'll go back one, thanks. Here we see the vision of the planet as a luminous cell, a blue orb swathed with clouds floating in black space. Someday, when images like this sink in, these moon's eye views of our world will revolutionize the way we think. Although in theory, every educated person knows that the world is more than people, resources, and a vague environment to be protected, the very fact of seeing it as one spherical air, water, land system gives it a new and different reality. From a vantage point outside our home, a revealing perspective has shown us the planet for what it really is. A ball of living stardust, a
for a 1 billion year old miracle. In a profound ecological sense, the world is now known as a unity. The various spheres, atmo, hydro, litho, and bio are intertwined and related, both in the historical evolutionary sense and in the present functional sense. Organic tissues of living things are fashioned from the elements of air, water, and soil, which in turn bear the imprints of life. Thus, the nutrient composition of seawater is maintained by organisms, which also stabilize the improbable composition of the atmosphere. Plants and animals form the limestone in mountains whose sediments make our bones. Our blood and seawater are intertwined. The reality of the world is not people and separate other things, nor is the earth a machine whose secrets lie in its fragmented parts. It is, beyond all understanding, an integrated ecosphere of marvelous creativity. The root meaning of eco is home, and the revealed ecosphere is the home sphere from which all life came and in which all life exists, as far as we know yet. Thanks to NASA, ecology, which means study of the home, has had its eyes opened to the reality of the home of all homes. So, thus saith Stan Rowe, Ecosphere studies ask, how can we be at home? How can we humans create and maintain stable and decent and just communities on this home of all homes? And Rowe wrote this essay that I read to you from. It's titled Ecosphere Thinking. He wrote it back in 1987. So just a few years before I was born, or after I was born, sorry. Young, but not that young. And so back in 1987, he may have known, Rowe may have already known, that humans were in an era of global change. But he might not have known yet at that time in 1987 or been able to predict the extent of that intensifying climate change. According to an article that was published last month in January 2018, and it's based on data from the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, quote, no one born since 1977 has experienced a cooler than average year compared to the 20th century average. I have only ever really lived in a warming planet. In a creative and integrated ecosphere, issues like climate change are also trickily complex and integrated, what some scholars have even identified as wicked problems, that they don't lend themselves to simple, easy, knowable solutions. So, for instance, when many people hear climate change, they think about parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and then the greenhouse effect of overall warming that could result in climate destabilization, and rightly so. Yet, if we're trying to start tracing that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we get into the fossil fuels. We get into industrialization, we get into histories of imperialism and colonization. We get into what Wes Jackson recognizes as carbon pools, backwards through the centuries. We have oil, we have natural gas, we have coal, we have forest, and back to soil. We get into the carbohydrate, literally carbon water, the calories of grains of carbohydrates grown and stored in surpluses. We get into the carbon that comprises our bodies, as we're carbon-based life itself. We get into human nature. So the problem of climate change is quite complex, and perhaps climate change is just a twist, and frankly very frightening twist, in a much longer and more complex story of our human relationship with carbon. Flip forward. And climate change is just linked to one of the 9 planetary boundaries that some of us humans are pushing on or have pushed through. There's also freshwater use, nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, ocean acidification, chemical pollution, atmospheric aerosol loading, ozone depletion, biodiversity loss, and land use change. What I want to emphasize is how setting the bounds of what we seek to know or understand as the ecosphere reminds us of the very real boundaries within which we all live. The Land Institute is working to transform agriculture so that it can fit within those boundaries, within the processes and places of the ecosphere. And as I explained earlier, this transformation grows from an analysis of agriculture's influence in the ecosphere, from thinking about the effects of agriculture over time. I'm going to flip forward. We think that to really grasp our current human predicament, we have to consider what's changed in the last 10 or 12,000 years in the context of a dynamic ecosphere that includes aspects of both emergent change and durable stability. So shout out, thanks to Tim Cruz for this wonderful slide. And you can imagine how this sort of not knowing could sort of spiral out into a lot of other effects, soil erosion being one of many of the effects of the social and ecological effects of agriculture. So in other words, when we try to understand the many facets of the social and the ecological troubles that we're in, you can name more: the injustices against basic rights, the global warming we've been talking about, biodiversity, the sort of slow violence of chemical toxicity, lots of harm done to humans and non-humans, it might be helpful to think about this slightly bigger picture path that agriculture has put us on. And I want to say this not because we're trying to blame any contemporary farmers who, especially for me, are my family members, our friends, our neighbors. We're trying instead to understand our predicament within the proper and appropriate context. It's because we're trying to figure out how to address the whole situation, not just solve one problem in a way that causes another problem and sort of keeps us in the loop that we've been in. Our mission statement at the Land Institute calls us to relate people, land, and community in a membership, and to consult nature, or the ecosphere, as the source and measure of that membership. If it were up to human cleverness alone, the task which we have ahead of us would be impossible, and maybe perhaps it is, I don't know. But if we humans are not working alone, if we recognize that we are never alone, and we never have been, if we can do our work in relationship and membership with lands and waters, and creatures and plants and soils and rocks and winds and the sunlight streaming in and the moonlight streaming down and reflected back, well, that will still be very difficult work, but it seems to me worth trying. I have enough affection for our home planet to be willing to try and understand how we evolved as humans, who we've become as farmers and agriculturalists, and who we might become if we are going to transform how we live and think and feed ourselves in generations to come. If, as Kate Raworth imagines, flip to the next slide, that we are going to have an equitable economy that fits within the ecosphere. Or if, as Wes Jackson imagines, we're going to have a sunshine future. This is from Raworth's book, Donut Economics. So we'll go ahead one more. Relating people and land and community in membership could mean remembering. What we know of Western scientific knowledge, which is new and emerging and verifiable, of course matters. And scientifically, there are also new concepts of social ecological memory, which is defined as the accumulated experiences and history of ecosystem management collectively held by a community. As the farmer and writer Wendell Berry envisions, there's the potential for traditions of rememberers, people who participate in calling forth and carrying forward the living memories of places, even within the Holocene being this very small slice of this great geologic time spiral that we come from and live within. So this more general and imaginative sense that the land remembers, that places can hold archival memories of past experiences, of trauma and loss, as well as growth and adaptation, and that they can hold and exert generative capabilities for remembering themselves in old or new forms. This sort of idea seems to me common across some agrarian as well as indigenous human communities. So you can flip forward. I think that some of us humans might need to remember what other human communities have given so much to try and hold on to hold together in living memory despite the dismembering violence of systems of oppression like settler colonialism. In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer, the brilliant Potawatomi botanist, reflects, quote, "So much has been forgotten, but it is not lost as long as the land endures and we cultivate people who have the humility and ability to listen and learn. And the people are not alone. All along the path, non-human people help. What knowledge the people have forgotten is remembered by the land. The others want to live too." Kimmerer weaves together scientific evidence, which has been put to the test, with indigenous knowledge, metaphor, and prophecy, which have also been put to other tests. And Kimmerer reminds us that knowledge extends far beyond the human. In order to find our way forward, she says, we might need to go back and pick up what was left behind in acts of remembering that involve both grief and joy. So Ecosphere Studies, emerging from an ecological worldview, works to integrate knowledge from where we've been and where we are now in order to find new ways forward. From a clear diagnosis of our agricultural present in a broader ecospheric context, we're working to generate new possibilities for living and thinking and learning, along with eating. So it's studies, plural, because, well, we need to try a lot of potential studies to find our way. You can flip forward another time. As a medieval humanities scholar, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, and planetary scientist and geophysicist, Linda Elkins Tanton, opened their collaborative book titled Earth. Earth is a home, a limit, and a recurring challenge. So let me try and be a little more practical about what we're doing actually in Ecosphere Studies to try to address this challenge of making a home within limits. Like, what does it look like to design and run thought experiments and feeling experiments that could influence the course of human consciousness? Whoa. What does it look like to theorize and test out ambitious approaches to these really complicated terms like agroecological culture or ecospheric education? So in homage to Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, I'm just going to give you 4 ways of looking at Ecosphere Studies. I'm going to go to the first here. Ecosphere Studies looks like people coming together to think in and with community. We're bringing together lots of people to create seedbeds of ideas through intellectual grounding work that works toward creating a comprehensive philosophy based upon our best knowledge of reality and an accounting within the real boundaries we've been talking about. People come together and they gather, they talk, they listen, they read, they reflect, they argue, they question, they categorize, they observe, they wonder. So these people are thinkers with all different kinds of training and experiences: historians, philosophers, farmers, agronomists, ecologists, lawyers, economists, theologians, artists, activists, educators, communicators, journalists, probably people who don't see themselves in that list who I've forgotten. We started with a conference in summer 2015, and then we've been holding events regularly since then. These collaborative events have resulted in writing projects and strategic plans going forward, and new inspirations for people to take home with them and to start imagining how to apply in their home places. Second, Ecosphere Studies looks like a school with an outdoor classroom and a library whose books include plants like trees. As Aldo Leopold noticed, quote, "Any riverbank farm is a library where he or she who hammers or saws may read at will." So we're designing and teaching classes in an effort to grow different forms of education out of that kind of seedbed of developing ideas. This photograph was from a workshop at the University of Kansas and the campus in Lawrence this past summer. For instance, can we learn with as well as about peoples and plants and places in our planet? This year, in 2018, we're going to be testing out a workshop model in which we offer immersive workshops for different groups like undergraduate students, teachers and educators, folks in the food movement. And these will be held in different locations across the country, including here in Kansas. Workshops on the margins of kind of traditional institutions of higher education might allow us as a project to move a little bit more nimbly in engaging learners and to more quickly grow change from the bottom up. Third, Ecosphere Studies looks like a kind of network with connections across systems and up and down different scales. We hope to work toward eventually engaging people across generational lines of all ages, informal school settings, like I said, but also beyond. Maybe even developing online learning tools that could be accessed for free, regardless of where people are, and also developing programs that aid our local community and think about regional systems and regional resilience. And fourth, Ecosphere Studies looks like a creative hub. You might already know the Land Institute out along the banks of the river as a hive kind of buzzing with activity, such as in our regular Fall Prairie Festival, when people come together to learn through guest speakers and tours and discussions and even some dancing. We're also planning more gatherings through Ecosphere Studies that bring people together in this kind of work of creative placemaking and collaborating with folks in the healing arts to design the kinds of expressions that will invite us into new forms of thinking and feeling, new aesthetic forms. I do want to say that as much as I personally am emotionally drawn to the need for healing and this language of healing, This language of healing might also imply that we're only seeking the recovery of an earlier state of health, like we can go back to some way before. And in some cases, maybe that is true, and we're pursuing. Maybe we can, and let's restore the prairie. But we humans are not going to escape our mortality or our aging, and we live in an ecosphere that has destructive qualities as well as creative. So if we're so bold and brazen as to hold something like planetary health as the common good that we want to serve, we might need to surrender some of our preconceived notions of healthy life as some type of static accomplishment, like health is something you get to and you stay there forever, rather than an emerging force, a process that includes decay as well as growth. We might need to reflect on some of our assumptions about what healthy lives or healthy bodies look like. Our root metaphors are so ingrained in us. Say it again, our root metaphors are so ingrained in us that it can be really hard to find the right language for this work. The words and the grammar and the ways we express ourselves, the stories we tell, these are really intertwined with our patterns of thought, our habits of mind, the ways we move through the world. Education and enculturation will matter, they do matter. And West has also pointed out the necessity of remedying, or at least seeing what he identifies as the problem of reassertion, the way that the dominant culture squashes out promising new ideas and reasserts the previous ones. Sort of like how we spray weed killer on ceilings and cracks in the sidewalks, but they keep coming back. So what's the next one? Ecosphere Studies is helping to articulate and nurture and spread the ecological worldview at the Land Institute. And since our scientists work with perennial plants, to call this related worldview a kind of perennial thinking might be apt, at least metaphorically, because in our teaching and learning, we seek to know how humans might persist through the years and grow in a community matrix of understanding. Look forward. Standing in the beautiful and the broken fields, rubbing that soil between our fingers, we are asking the questions that keep coming back. We have some time for questions and discussion, I think. If you need to get some more to eat or drink, feel free to move up and mill around. I will try my best to answer questions, but there are also lots of people here in the audience who have lots of knowledge and answers maybe to share as well. So I might call on someone else to answer a question as well as ask. I'll open it up at this point. Yeah.
Where are Ecosphere Studies happening?
We are currently putting together our workshop series, and we'll be launching that more publicly. But some of the locations that we have connections and relationships across the country include the Northeast, include Iowa, include Colorado, and the one workshop that is already up for sort of public enrollment will be happening in Colorado at Western State Colorado University this coming June. And it's offered through their Summer Teacher Institute, so it's targeted at teachers and educators and working with them on the kinds of curriculum and lesson plans that they create. But hopefully in the coming months we will have more of an announcement about where and how you can get involved, especially here in Salina and in Kansas at some of the workshop places will offer.
Aubrey, I put out, and I sent to you also, an article that Sharon Texler, formerly at Westford, now near Chicago, that put out from the Atlantic just recently, and I'm actually blanking on the name of the author, but it was an overview of search for perennial agriculture. And one of the points that he made at the last of it was that they are looking, scientists, agronomists are looking perhaps at tuber plants because they have more protein per acre, and relatively speaking, cassava, other kinds of things. And I'm wondering if you or any of the ecospheric folk here would comment about that. Is that, are there interactions with those people? What's the discussion?
The article is the one, the Charles Mann piece that was in the Atlantic.
That's it.
Yeah, I think it's from his book, The Wizard and the Prophet, which I haven't read yet.
How do you think you overcome the economic incentives to continue as we have been doing?
The question was, how do you overcome the economic incentives to just keep doing what we've been doing? So I would say there are lots of incentives for people to continue, but there are lots of people who are also dissatisfied with the kind of ever accelerating treadmill that we've been on. So many people in younger generations who have a lot of student loan debt and can't get jobs and can't afford housing or afford access to healthcare, the economic incentives are not very persuasive anymore. And so there's a way in which the system itself might lead to some of those. But this larger question about how to create an economy that exists within the real confines of the ecosphere is one where a lot of people are interested in investigating. And this is part of the question that we're asking, I think. I mean, I talked about the language of agriculture being part of the way, not only the way we act, but the way we think, and arguably the language of our capitalist economy has the same effects, right? Like, we value people who are productive, and we talk about productivity in these really kind of extractive ways. And so there's a way in which it's the material aspect, it's also the intellectual aspect, and that's one of the questions I think that we're going to have to keep coming back to. So I don't know the answer, but I hope that by working with a lot of people and collaborating on some of these questions and working with some organizations that have continued to do this work and have been asking those questions for decades, that there might be a possibility of finding some type of answer as we live within a system that's also meeting the wall in a lot of ways. Do you have an idea in response before you move to a different question? I'm always curious to hear people's answers they might have in mind.
I think you have to make it economically satisfying to do the right thing. And I'm not sure I have the answer, but the thing that you said was talking about young people who maybe have a different attitude, as opposed to people that have lived with us all along. So that would be my initial thought.
I liked very much the beauty of your presentation. You chose aesthetically pleasing pieces, you chose works of art to share, the view of the whole earth from space. And I believe that opening to feeling is an avenue out of the myth of economic, used to be economic man, economic person, whatever they call it now. There actually are starting to be people debunking the notion that we make economic decisions. And I think that we're more than ready to make some hard decisions. The people who come to live in the rural areas, and they're coming in their 30s and 40s, do so not for economic reasons.
Yeah, we often think in making economic decisions means that we're sort of acting as rational actors and like thinking rationally, but I think there's growing work in neuroscience and other fields where how humans think and how our brains work is very much in relationship to our bodies, and something like emotions and reason are sort of a piece, not sort of separate fields the way that we've been taught. And maybe that offers some new possibilities for how we think about exerting change within those systems. Maybe it's not just about making the most, I want rational arguments, like I'm very in support of reason and facts, but maybe there's also ways in which we can think about how more holistically or in a more integrated way about emotions and feelings and aesthetics. And that has to be part of the conversation. As a humanities person, I'm going to eat that right up. So.
I want to just mention that in some reading I did, it's been several months ago, Jim Hightower was pointing out how, for example, this is true across the technological spectrum, actually today applies, but John Deere, for example, has written in its contracts that only its people can do work on it, and if you tamper with it, of course you've messed up the warranty. But the electronics, the way these kinds of large systems now function, essentially make even more the operator a serf, a slave, and he's just carrying out the orders of the boss, even the technology offered. And I can't help but wonder if that, if there might not be, to your point about emotion, some sort of emotional reaction. Finally, people saying, "I'm not putting up with this, fill in the blank anymore." So I just thought.
Yeah, that's really intriguing. Thank you. Some thoughts about how we see government functioning in relationship to the
caring
larger,
for the earth.
To caring for the earth, yeah. Wow. Well, I mean, I guess, think about that. I guess that, there are the effects of self-governing systems at all kinds of different scales. And so when we say government, we often think automatically about like the federal government level, especially at this moment in US history. But if we think about government as sort of agreed upon norms and rules and regulations for human behavior, then that maybe opens more possibilities for thinking about how governing forces can emerge from systems, and from how we can think about our responsibilities and roles and places and within those systems at different types of scales too. So this question, for instance, about the role of government for farming often means thinking about, farm bill policy or federal regulations, and that's one thing, but there's also ways to think about government at smaller and more local scales. And I'm not sure yet for our particular work, what the role of government and policy is. It's certainly intertwined with the kinds of questions that people are asking about human behavior and the rules of societies and the kinds of economic decision making that we're doing. But for our particular project, I don't know if we've arrived at a kind of definitive analysis or an idea, or at least I have as a person in my early 30s, about this is the way it should work. I do think that if you're thinking about caring for the earth, and when I think about my own care for the earth, and I think about the kind of ethic of care I want my son to have, I showed him playing in the dirt. I don't know whether that's how to think about governing that. That's a real question for me. How can you have government that has that as a possibility, but to use government as force for that, I don't know. I think this would be something that I would have to turn over to more people, but I want to know your answer too. I'm going to make you speak a little bit about what led you to ask the question, or what thoughts you have about the role of government.
Well, I have to plead. I have a motive. I'm the state coordinator for Citizens Climate Law.
Oh, it's wonderful.
And I'm trying to get Kansas involved at the table. And that means our U.S. representatives. And we have a Climate Solutions Caucus now in Congress with 70 members, 35 Republicans and 35 Democrats. And, we don't have their mind made up on any kind of policy. They're just discussing climate solutions. And that we're talking at really the global level when you're talking about U.S. Congress. And that to me is very appealing, and that's why I volunteer my time doing it. That I can't imagine anything of the magnitude that we need happening without the darn government.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a real point to make too about our government and also our legal system. I mean, a lot of social and cultural movements that have actually succeeded in enacting some type of change have come about because of policy changes due to legal actions. And so I don't at all want to discount that. I mean, that seems really valuable to me. Thank you for the work of CCO. Do we need to end, or we have
I think it seems like we're ready to end, but you can sure stay and talk to Aubrey afterwards. And Aubrey, when you get these things figured out, you can let us know.
I hope you all